Stuff. Right then, let's go. Right, well, thank you very much to everyone at the Church's Conservation Trust for giving me the opportunity to showcase this church at Strensham and to talk about the recent community-led project to restore the ring of bells in the tower. You may well have heard of Strensham, of course, from the M5 motorway services on the Worcestershire and Gloucestershire border. Now, the church is one of the 356 that's looked after by the Church's Conservation Trust, and the only regular activity there in normal times is bell ringing, and mostly for teaching purposes. The bell ringers organise an annual tea party to raise funds for the CCT, and this single event usually makes about £600 to £800. It's advertised on local radio, Facebook, etc., and tends to attract very many visitors, so many in fact that we have to rely on the generosity of the local farmer to be able to use their field for car parking. As you can see from this drone photograph taken by local resident Peter Reed, the church is in a very prominent, albeit remote, site on the rise above the River Avon, which is just behind the church there. The name Strensham is derived from the Old English Strongham, meaning strong village, and it's first recorded in 972 when lands at Strensham were returned to the abbey at Pershore by King Edgar. By about 1255, the Russell family under James Russell were the lords of the manor of Strensham, and the family remained the landowners for nearly 540 years. In 1388, Sir John Russell was Master of the Horse to King Richard II, and he was granted a licence by the king to crenellate or fortify a mansion house at Strensham, and this almost certainly related to the former Strensham Castle on a moated site about half a mile to the west. Among the many brasses and monuments inside the church is this memorial brass to Sir John Russell. There are also several carved monuments to the later Russells. This one on the south side of the screen of the chancel is that of Sir Thomas Russell, who died in 1632, and his wife Elizabeth. In 1627, their eldest son, Sir William Russell, was made the first Baronet of Whitley by Charles I, and he was a royalist officer at Worcester during the First English Civil War, and as Governor of Worcester he refused entry to the Parliamentary Cavalry shortly before the Battle of Powick Bridge in September 1642, and this was the very first cavalry skirmish of the Civil War. William was also involved in the First English Civil War right through to its end, and was at the Siege of Worcester in 1646, where he was singled out at the surrender for delivery to Parliament as a prisoner, as can be seen in this pamphlet from the time. And Strensham Castle was plundered by the parliamentarian soldiers as punishment, and the Russell family suffered severe financial losses, so that when William died in 1669, his memorial on the north side of the chancel was very plain compared to his parents'. Also on the north side of the chancel is this superbly carved marble monument. It's in memory of William's son and heir, Sir Francis Russell, the second baronet, and he died in 1706, and that of his wife Anne. They had no male issue, so the baronetcy came to an end. Now, as you can see from this photograph, taken from the top of the Malvern Hills, about 9 miles away, the church is in a very exposed position, and it suffered badly from the elements over the years. By the 1980s, rainwater was leaking in, and the moisture was causing the pews and the floors to rot. And the cost of keeping up with this serious erosion became too much for the parish to cope with, and the church was vested in 1991 with the CCT, who undertook a major restoration to preserve the building and its superb interior. And here's a view from the inside of the church looking east towards the Russell monuments at the end there. At the west end is an elaborately carved and painted gallery and the font. Now, the tower used to be open to the rest of the church, but at some point it was walled up, possibly when the gallery was built. You can see an archway behind the organ there. Now, as you can imagine from its exposed position, from the top of the tower there were unbroken views in all directions. This is the view looking west over the old moated site of the castle and onto the Malvern Hills. Here's a view taken in 2012 of the bells in their rather unusually diagonally positioned bell frame, which is basically medieval in date. Nothing's much known about the bells prior to the Reformation, but in 1705 a new ring of 5 bells was cast and the bell frame was modified, and that's when it was repositioned diagonally in the tower. But by 1890 the 2 largest bells were broken. and in 1911 they were replaced and a smaller sixth bell added by extending the bell frame. Here's a photo of the 6 bells ringing. This photo was taken from a hole in the stairwell just below the roof. Some 100 years after the installation, though, the fittings had been exposed to the elements blowing into the tower windows for all this time, and the corrosion was becoming very obvious. Something needed to be done to conserve and preserve the installation. Now, Strensham Church is quite a large tower, and it was always in the back of my mind whether any restoration work on the 6 bells could include adding 2 extra ones. And this would provide a wider range of training and be much more interesting and challenging to bell ringers. And with the help of the Celtic Trust, which is a charity that rehomes second-hand bells, we were able to track down 2 available bells which had come from a church in Kettering. And here are those 2 bells in storage. And we also had their fittings, including the large wooden wheels and the headstocks. That's the cast iron beams to which the bells are bolted and allows them to rotate. And a schedule of work was put together which proposed this new layout for the 8 bells. This not only respected the historical aspects of the medieval bell frame in the middle, but would also involve only very minor work to the 1911 framework to house 2 bells instead of 1. After consent was granted from the CCT and Wych Avon Council, because it's a Grade 1 listed building, promises of sufficient money to fund the project quickly came in. The interest among the local ringers was considerable, and we were soon able to fund the entire project. However, to keep the costs low, really low, as much as possible had to be done by knowledgeable and experienced volunteers, of which we had several, and we only had to pay specialist contractors when necessary. The downside, of course, was that the work would take much, much longer, but there was no hurry. The 2 new bells were collected and taken to Strensham, where they were unloaded and stored in the tower. Ringing on the bells ceased in March 2017, and the work started to disassemble the bells for a specialist bell hanging company run by Matthew Higby in Somerset to conserve the fittings. An opportunity then arose to have the oldest bells retuned so that their tone better matched the other bells in the tower. So, after gaining the necessary additional permission, they were lowered to the bottom of the tower and taken away, together with their fittings. And here's a photograph of one of the old bells being reprofiled on a tuning machine. In May 2018, the retuned bells came back, but were still minus their fittings, which were still being conserved. They needed more refurbishment. However, we had the fittings for the 2 new bells, so the first one to be assembled and tested was this one, the treble bell. In May 2019, the restored fittings were delivered, and work started on reassembling each bell one by one. And over the next few months, all 8 bells were finished and tested, and the first ringing took place in time for Christmas 2019. And here's a photograph of the bells ringing, taken from above them again. Now, before the lockdown in March 2020, when, for the first time since the Second World War, the ringing of church bells all over the country stopped, the new octave at Strensham had been rung just 5 times. But the total head count for those 5 times was 90 people. The sound of bells has traditionally celebrated events in all our lives, and Strensham bells will ring again to mark the passing of this situation we find ourselves in. This ambitious community-led project was only made possible because of the support and the commitment of those involved, and from the staff from the CCT. Now, if you've got an idea for your CCT church, however big the idea is, and the drive to make it succeed, well, why not give it a go? In fact, we are already planning our next project, albeit on a much smaller scale. The top of the tower is an ideal location to install a peregrine falcon nesting box. So we're going to make one and put it in place sometime this year. Give nature a home and it will move in, as the saying goes. Now, if this talk has aroused an interest in bell ringing and you'd like to know more about this fascinating hobby, then there's plenty to find on the internet. The Central Council of Church Bell Ringers have a web presence, which is a good starting point, or just pop along to your local church when you have the opportunity. Strensham Church itself will be reopened as soon as the current lockdown is eased, so please come along and visit and see the treasures inside for yourself. And thanks for listening. Hope that was okay.